A neurologist walks into his hospital ward and finds something he has never seen in 20 years of medicine. His patients are frozen, not unconscious, not sedated, awake, eyes open, some of them blinking, but completely, utterly still. Some haven't moved in hours. Some haven't moved in days. A few are sitting in chairs in the exact same position they were in when the nursing staff last checked on them 12 hours ago. This disease would go on to infect 5 million people across every continent. 1 in 3 of them died, and many of the survivors, some of them young, some of them teenagers, would spend the next 40 years frozen in that same state, waiting. And then in 1930, with no cure ever found, no cause ever confirmed, it vanished completely. This is encephalitis lethargica, the sleeping sickness that turned people into living statues. And the question nobody has answered in over 100 years: what was it, and could it come back?
50 years ago, medical virology was in its infancy. And if sleepy sickness was...
The man who first documented this disease was an Austrian neurologist named Konstantin von Economo. In late 1916, he started noticing patients arriving with what appeared to be extreme sleepiness, but this was not ordinary drowsiness. These patients couldn't be roused properly, or if they were woken, they drifted back into stillness within minutes. Economo called it encephalitis lethargica, inflammation of the brain causing lethargy. He published his findings in 1917, but he was largely ignored because 1918 brought the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu killed approximately 100 million people in 2 years. It consumed the attention of every government, every hospital, every medical researcher. And encephalitis lethargica, which was quietly infecting hundreds of thousands of people at the exact same time, got almost no resources, almost no attention, and almost no funding. Here is the timeline that makes researchers nervous. Encephalitis lethargica appears in 1917. The Spanish flu peaks in 1918. Many patients seem to develop the neurological disease in the weeks immediately following influenza infection. The geographic spread of both diseases overlaps almost perfectly. Was encephalitis lethargica caused by the flu? A post-viral immune reaction triggered by influenza? We will come back to this, because the answer, or rather the lack of one, is the most disturbing part of the whole story. What we know for certain is this: between 1917 and 1930, roughly 5 million people worldwide contracted encephalitis lethargica. About 1.5 million died in the acute phase. Of the survivors, a large proportion entered a chronic neurological state that looked to anyone watching like they had simply switched off. And by 1930, almost as if someone had flipped a switch in the other direction, the epidemic was over. New cases dropped to almost zero. It has never returned.
Aware of their own condition.
The name says encephalitis, which means brain inflammation. But this wasn't a generalized infection that spread diffusely through the whole brain. It was targeted. It attacked specific structure. The primary target was the substantia nigra, a small pigment-rich region deep in the midbrain. If you know anything about Parkinson's disease, that name will sound familiar. The substantia nigra is exactly the structure that degenerates in Parkinson's. It produces dopamine. It fine-tunes motor control. When it's damaged, movement becomes rigid. Facial expression flattens. The voice goes quiet. The body loses its ability to initiate action. Encephalitis lethargica patients, many of them in their 20s and 30s, were developing what looked exactly like advanced Parkinson's disease, decades before Parkinson's was even well understood. The disease also attacked the hypothalamus, which governs the sleep-wake cycle, and the reticular activating system, a network in the brainstem that functions as the brain's arousal switch. Damage these structures and you don't just feel tired, you lose the architecture of wakefulness itself. This explains something that baffled clinicians at the time. The disease produced completely opposite presentations in different patients. Some became the statue-like catatonic patients, barely responsive, sleeping 20 hours a day. Others became hyperactive, unable to sleep, at all agitated and restless. Same disease, same epidemic. Wildly different outcomes depending on exactly where in those brainstem structures the damage landed. Some patients experienced what are called oculogeric crises. Their eyes would lock involuntarily, usually upward for minutes or hours at a time. They were fully conscious, they could feel it happening, they could not stop it. And many patients, particularly children, underwent severe personality changes, aggressive, impulsive, antisocial behavior that bore no resemblance to who they had been before. Courts in the 1920s began accepting post-encephalitic behavior as a legal defense in juvenile cases. That is how completely this disease could rewrite a person. And then after the acute phase came the state that would define these patients for the rest of their lives. The post-encephalitic suspension. They could walk when prompted, they could speak when spoken to, they could follow simple instructions. But left alone, they initiated nothing, started nothing, sat in the same chair in the same position, and waited for reasons they themselves couldn't articulate. Some of these patients were admitted to institutions in the late 1920s. They were still there in the 1960s. 40 years later, unchanged. In 1969, a young neurologist named Oliver Sacks is working at Beth Abraham Hospital. The hospital has a ward full of post-encephalitic patients, survivors of the 1917 epidemic, who have been frozen in that suspended state for 40 years. They were teenagers and young adults when the disease took them. Now, they are in their 60s and 70s. They have lived in institutions since the late 1920s. The world outside has changed completely. 2 world wars, the atomic bomb, television, the moon landing, and they have sat in the same chairs. Sacks decides to try something. A new drug has just become available. L-Dopa, a dopamine precursor developed to treat Parkinson's disease. The reasoning is straightforward if these patients have lost dopaminergic cells in their substantia nigra. And if L-Dopa can partially replenish dopamine, maybe something shifts. What happened next is one of the most remarkable documented events in the history of neurology. Patients who had barely moved in years began to stir, then to stand, then to walk, then to speak fluently, coherently, with complete access to their pre-illness memories and personalities. Sacks writes about one patient in particular. He calls her Rose Art in his book. She had been frozen since 1926. When the L-Dopa took effect, she woke up and immediately wanted to know about everything she had missed. Music, Hitchcock and fashion, films to current events. She had opinions. She had humor. She recognized family members. She was, by every account, herself, fully and completely herself, despite 43 years of neurological imprisonment. She had been in there the whole time. But the awakenings didn't hold. As dosages were adjusted and increased over the following weeks, patients began to destabilize. The drug that had freed them started producing its own complications, involuntary movements, confusion, hallucinations in some cases. The therapeutic window was almost impossibly narrow. One by one, most patients regressed, not quite back to full suspension, but far from the vivid clarity of those early weeks. Rosar deteriorated gradually. She died in 1979, 10 years after her awakening. Sacks turned this experience into his book, Awakenings, which later became a film with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. He described these patients as the most important teachers of his career. They forced him, he said, to ask questions about consciousness and identity that medicine had never properly confronted. Now, the question that has never been answered: what caused encephalitis lethargica? 5 million cases, over a century of research, and we still don't know. The leading hypothesis has always been influenza specifically, that encephalitis lethargica was a post-infectious autoimmune reaction to the 1918 Spanish flu. The mechanism is called molecular mimicry. Some viral proteins structurally resemble proteins found in human brain tissue. Your immune system generates antibodies against the virus, but those antibodies can cross-react with your own neurons. In this case, researchers suspect the target was the basal ganglia. It's a plausible mechanism. We now have well-documented examples of post-viral autoimmune encephalitis. NMDA receptor encephalitis being the clearest modern parallel, causing psychiatric and neurological symptoms eerily similar to encephalitis lethargica. But here is the problem. When researchers in the 2000s examined preserved brain tissue from encephalitis lethargica patients, tissue that had been stored for nearly a century, they found no influenza virus. Not in the neurons, not in the surrounding glial tissue. Nothing. That doesn't definitively rule out the influenza connection. A post-infectious autoimmune process wouldn't necessarily leave viral particles behind. But it means the hypothesis remains circumstantial, unconfirmed. And then the question that should unsettle you: why did it stop in 1930? If we don't know what caused it, we cannot explain its disappearance. And if we cannot explain its disappearance, we cannot guarantee it won't return. When Rose R. woke up after 43 years and was immediately, recognizably herself, her personality intact, her memories accessible, her sense of humor present, it raised a question medicine still can't fully answer. Where was she during those 40 years? The self apparently doesn't need to be running in order to be preserved. It can be latent, stored, waiting, and yet within weeks the disease reclaimed her. The self was indestructible and utterly vulnerable at the same time. That paradox is, I think, the most human thing this disease ever revealed. Encephalitis lethargica has no confirmed cause. No cure was ever developed. And after infecting 5 million people, it simply stopped leaving behind no explanation and no guarantee it won't return.